again welcome to this exciting and important Workplace Freedom Day event on the 2022 Philippines presidential elections bank account votes and drones. So my name is Nalin Latin, Program Coordinator at Asia Centers, and I will be your Master of Ceremony for today. And before I begin, I would like to inform you that we are now live on Asia Center Facebook page, so please feel free to share the links, the Facebook Live links with your colleagues and your network. And also, let me remind you of our Zoom guidelines. For online participants, please make sure to mute yourselves and turn off your videos. And if you have any questions, please send up through our chat box Zoom below. And also, we'll put all the updates on the chat box. So. And before we start, I would like to have a quick pause from the online participants. So the question is, which media do you think has had more influence over voter sentiment so far on this presidential election campaign trail? So mainstream media or social media? So don't forget to vote on seeing people start putting the answer. Okay, so we'll share the results in a couple of minutes. And next, I would like to give you a short overview of our event today. So these roundtable discussions on the 2022 Philippines presidential elections is convened on behalf of Asia Center and Friedrich Naumann's foundations to commemorate the Workplace Freedom Day on 3rd May. And you will hear from our speakers and our reactors on how the elections campaign is shaping up in 6 days before our Filipinos go to the polls, and how the social media was used during the campaigns as well as its impact on the polls. And for those who would like to receive more information and news from Asia Center and Friedrich Naumann's foundations, please feel free to like and follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube channels. And here is our program for today. So the event will start with welcome remarks from Friedrich Naumann foundations and Asia Centers. And then we'll turn the floor to our speakers, and then the discussion will be followed by our reactors who are here with us in the studios. And then we will open the floor to Q&A sessions and wrap up the events with closing remarks. So without further ado, now I would like to invite Vanessa Steinmetz, Regional Project Coordinators, Friedrich Naumann Foundation, South and East Asia, to make a welcome remarks and perhaps give us a short overview of Friedrich Naumann Foundation. So Vanessa, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me today. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, as you can read, my name is Vanessa Steinmetz. I'm working for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Southeast and East Asia, our regional office here in Bangkok since 2 years now already. We have the Friedrich Naumann Foundation is a German foundation, it's a political foundation affiliated with the Free Democrats party from Germany, who is also currently part of the government coalition. Philippines, we do have an office, but also in 6 other countries in the Southeast and East Asia region. As I said, I'm very happy to be here. Before joining FNF, I have been working as a journalist for nearly a decade. Most of the time, I was part of the Asia desk at the online outlet of the political magazine Der Spiegel in Hamburg. Some of you may already know it. I'm very honored to mark this day today, the World Press Freedom Day, that should not only remind governments, but really everyone about the importance of press freedom for liberal democracies all around the world. This day should also remind us to support independent media, which are under threat and pressure all around the world. With the Philippines, as I said, example, Having said that, I'm looking forward to your discussion today and thank Asia Center and all of the participants for making this possible today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So there were Vanessa and Friedrich on evaluations of East and East Asia. So next, may I please invite Dr. James Gomez, Regional Director of Asia Center, who will be our facilitator for today's discussion. So Dr. James, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Vanessa, for being here. Asia Center, undertakes research, evidence-based research in issues related to freedom of expression, especially to deal more and more, not only with media freedoms, but also digital rights. In fact, I think it's timely that this year's theme for World Press Freedom Day is aptly called Journalism Under Digital Siege. The key question really is media, as we know it today, traditional media, is it being now censored and displaced by the move to the online platform, rightly or wrongly? So this is the question that Asia Center has been investigating through its evidence-based research. We organize activities and events like this, always in partnership. And because we are also accredited with the UN ECOSOC, we are now increasingly able to make submissions to the UN. In fact, Voice of America Thailand contacted us yesterday to get our opinion on the state of press freedoms in Thailand. So these are some of the work that we do, and we work with partners and we extend the reach of our partners in the region. So I'm very, very pleased that we are able to co-convene the event today. Without further ado, I would now like to invite our first speaker based in Manila, Maritas Bituk, Editor-at-Large at Rappler, to share her thoughts and views about what she has seen in terms of how the media landscape has played out this election trail in the 2022 presidential elections in the Philippines. Maritas, over to you.
Hi, you hear me well?
Loud and clear, Maritas.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to the Asia Center for inviting me to speak in this panel. There are a number of reasons why the front runner in the Philippine presidential race is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son and namesake of the late dictator who ruled the Philippines for 2 decades, stifled democracy, stole anywhere from $5 billion to $10 billion US from the public coffers, sent thousands to jail, and had thousands more killed. But today, I will focus on just on one reason. The Marcoses used social media extensively for a number of years to rehabilitate their image by peddling lies. In 2019, Rappler reported that the Marcos playbook consisted of using massive amounts of propaganda amplified in a coordinated manner through an extensive network of Facebook pages and groups that are anonymously managed. Anonymously managed through, and also use YouTube channels, social media influencers, and websites. The Marcos disinformation campaign began quietly in 2010 in what seemed to be fringe groups, but they became very active in 2014, or 2 years before the 2016 elections, wherein Marcos Jr. ran for vice president and lost. Their content did the following. First, they downplayed or denied the kleptocracy and human rights violations during the martial law years. Second, they exaggerated the late dictator's achievements. And third, they vilified critics, rivals, and mainstream media. Many of the Marcoses' claims have been debunked by historians and proven to be false. A number of pages and accounts had also been taken down by Facebook because they posted spammy content and for coordinating inauthentic behavior. Still, the Marcoses used social media cleverly and also reached the new generation of Filipinos through YouTube and TikTok. As we have found out, YouTube is a haven for disinformation. In April 2021, Rappler reported that lies about the wealth of the family of the late dictator continued to spread on YouTube without labels or warnings. This happened even though the claims have been previously fact-checked and historians had denounced them as fallacy. Yet, supporters have attempted also to gain sympathy for Marcos Jr. by portraying the Marcos family as victims of injustice. Even after Bongbong lost in 2016, Bongbong is the nickname of Marcos Jr. The Marcoses kept up the disinformation drive and, as I said earlier, conquered TikTok and Twitter. Although in January this year, Twitter suspended more than 300 accounts from the support base of Marcos Jr. for violating the company's platform manipulation and spam policy. Now, in 2022, in a few days, we will have the presidential elections. It's a race between Robredo and Marcos Jr. This information has intensified in the lead up to the May 9 election. A recent study shows that election disinformation since the filing of candidacies in October last year up to mid-February this year has targeted mainly these two candidates, Robredo and Marcos Jr. Vice President Robredo, who leads the opposition, ranked second in the polls. But here's the big difference. Robredo was the subject of negative messaging, while Marcos was the subject of positive branding. A professor from the University of the Philippines and a leader of Check.ph, a fact-checking group from the academe, media, and civil society, Yvonne Chua, conducted the study together with a colleague from the university. Chua said that Robredo's quotes have been mangled, twisted, or fabricated to make her look like she's spouting nonsense. She has been called rather harshly lightheaded, stupid, stammerer, and Madam, M-A-D-U-M-B. In the case of Marcos Jr., the study said a lot of the disinformation were false endorsements from celebrities and even heads of state, like the New Zealand Prime Minister, who was said to have endorsed him when this was not true. Facebook was found to be the biggest enabler of disinformation of all the social networking sites, followed by YouTube and TikTok. A separate study, also by an academic from De La Salle University, Cheryl Ruth Soriano, found that the YouTube algorithm and structure allow this information about the Marcos family and the martial law era to spread on the platform. The authors of the study found 600 videos on YouTube that promoted the narrative that the Philippines was a great nation during the regime of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. The narrative further claimed that under the leadership of Marcos, the country was an economic superpower, that his brand of democracy was the most just, he was a revered leader worldwide, and he had available personal wealth for the benefit of our country's progress. And the final part of the narrative, said the authors of the study, was that all of this can only be achieved once again if another Marcos would be reinstalled into power. Here in the Philippines, there are 45 million adult viewers of YouTube, or around 68% of the 65 million registered voters for the 2022 election. To counter disinformation, various organizations from the media, academe, and civil society have gotten together. They are doing good work. We have Facts First PH, Tech.ph. We also have a movement against disinformation, composed of academics and other civil society leaders. They're trying to stop the choice of our next leader based on a mountain of lies. So on that hopeful note, I end my talk and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Maritas, for your take in what I largely see as how you explain the campaign as being very much a disinformation campaign compared to when traditional media was used more for negative campaigning. But we can come back to that question as a follow-up. Next, we have Krisha Subing, journalist at the Philippines Daily Inquirer. Krisha, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. May I request Nalerna to please present my slides? All right. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Krisha Subing, a reporter from the Manila-based Philippine Daily Inquirer. It's an honor to be speaking in front of you today. Thank you, Asia Center, for inviting me. Today, I will be talking about the disinformation landscape in the Philippines as well. I only have 5 to 7 minutes, but I hope that our local experiences can help paint you a picture of what is going on here. Next slide, please. When we talk about disinformation or fake news, we often associate that image with trolls or bots or paid hacks groups or pages that are paid to push certain narratives in the public sphere. But disinformation experts would now argue that that is just one level of analysis, as trolls are just part of a larger disinformation machinery that also includes influencers, celebrities, even government agencies, and sympathetic media outlets that work in concert to seed fake or misleading content to manipulate public opinion. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, disinformation networks have become endemic in the Philippine cyberspace since 2016, when President Duterte successfully used social media to prop up his candidacy. And the problem now is that the average Filipino user is particularly susceptible because we are heavy social media users. A lot of Filipinos even say that they rely more on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube for news than on mainstream media. And this is not just a local problem, but a global problem as well, as autocrats try to delegitimize media as part of their efforts to quell dissent and criticism. Next slide. So given this, we now have the moral imperative to counter disinformation because it threatens democracy by hampering people's ability to make enlightened decisions for their lives and for the future of our nation. Next slide. And there is no clearer example of this, of how disinformation has distorted the decision-making abilities of Filipinos than in the upcoming May 2022 elections, as Ms. Vitog has mentioned earlier. Right now, the two front-runners, Bongbong Marcos, son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., and Vice President Leni Robredo are the biggest targets of disinformation, although this affects them very differently, as Ms. Vitog mentioned earlier. Next slide. So several studies and reports have made it clear that the Marcoses have been using social media to try to rehabilitate their image from that of an excessive, power-hungry family that was ousted by the Filipino people in 1986 to a family that is are respectable public servants. In short, disinformation surrounding them seeks to promote a positive image of them. And how do they do that? As this Washington Post report said, the Marcoses and other politicians in general rely not just on troll farms, but on micro-influencers who have a few thousand followers. The same report found that an influencer with 10,000 followers can earn between $5,800 to $6,800 on a monthly retainer basis during the election season. And for comparison, that amount is 10 times more than an average teacher's salary. Next slide. My colleagues and I also recently published a report, actually funded by Internews, on how his family and their supporters use TikTok to create unfact-checkable content. So what do we mean by unfact-checkable content? It's easy to report videos that have, outright false claims, but you can't fact-check or report videos that are just clips of people saying Marcos is the best leader or Marcos is a kind leader, or just videos of them doing random acts of kindness and then it's overlaid on emotional background music. It's meant to manipulate people, but there is no basis to take them down on their existing social media policies. Next slide. On the other hand, Robredo, who is the person I'm currently following now on the campaign trail, is considered the #1 victim of disinformation, as mentioned earlier. So if Marcos benefits from positive disinformation, she is the target of hateful content. And as you can see from the slides, what kind of propaganda is being hurled against her. Next slide. So I have personally seen how troll armies, especially on Twitter, have been weaponized against her to push this certain narrative. So every time reporters covering her post content about her, a deluge of accounts would suddenly flood our notifications saying she's stupid, she's useless, or she's a mere housewife who isn't eligible for the presidency. And it's obvious they're trolls because they sound like they're reading from a script. But the definitive proof of this is when you reverse search their image and pictures of real people come out, like this in this example here, the second slide. A certain Philip Pagkalinawan account used the picture of the Voice finalist Judge Benson to create that account. Next slide. These are just some examples of 4 different accounts that were all created on February 2022 and which tweeted the exact same content about falsehoods about Robredo's alleged links to the Communist Party of the Philippines, which has been completely debunked. But unfortunately, even though we try to report as many of these as possible, a lot of them remain online, where unsuspecting users see their content and believe them and share them to their own networks. Next slide. But as I have mentioned, trolls and bots are not just the only actors in the disinformation ecosystem. These myths and narratives persist because of micro-influencers or influencers, celebrities that have a huge following on social media who propagate that same lines uncritically. Two of these examples are Jam Magno, Thinking Pinoy. These are two influencers in the Philippines that have really huge following on social media. And they create content to attack Robredo, their allies, and her daughters. And these content are gobbled up by their followers. And unfortunately, even though they have been repeatedly found to violate community standards, the platforms that host them still refuse to take them down. And it's unclear whether they're able to monetize from these posts. Next slide. And then these are examples of media outlets in the Philippines that also peddle, the same narratives or have taken things out of context to paint Robredo in a bad light. So like this misleading quote card on the left, this is from SMNI News, an outlet founded by a pastor close to Duterte and who is wanted by the FBI on sexual trafficking charges. The quote card made it appear that if Robredo wins the presidency, she said that nothing will change. But the full quote was actually something like, nothing will change about her hands-on personality and her grassroots form of governance. Next slide. So in short, these networks of disinformation, from trolls to political strategists to influencers to the media, they hijack spaces of discourse and they can be weaponized to silence critics and dull government opposition. So what is currently being done about this? Apart from fact-checking groups, I believe civil and media groups have already written social media giants to act on the problem of disinformation here, because the problem is not just a lack of policies. Actually, they have good policies, but the problem is the sluggishness of enforcement and taking down errant accounts. So I guess the biggest takeaway really here is that we still have a long way to go in combating disinformation. And unfortunately, the actions that we will take on that depends on who Filipinos will vote for on May 9. So as we celebrate World Press Freedom today, as a journalist myself, I share the hopes that the next president of the Philippines will be someone who is not just respectful of the freedom of the press and of the media, but someone who can decisively act on fake news as well. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Krisha, for your analysis, and thank you for developing this idea first unpacked by Maritas on disinformation as a campaign tool, and you have nicely contoured it by explaining that the trolls are only part of the ecosystem. There are also influencers and celebrities that amplify this disinformation, and that's something we need to take note. And you ended off by sort of just throwing up what is the way forward and what are the counter steps we can take to combat disinformation. I will now move on to the next speaker, Greg Kehalia, the country director of Internews Philippines. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share my screen to run my slide directly. Oh, it seems screen sharing is disabled.
Can you have a go again?
Yeah, same thing. Okay, it works now. Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. And yes, good afternoon, everyone. I am Greg Kehalia. I am the country director of Internews in the Philippines. And it is an honor to be speaking in front of you today. I wish a happy World Freedom Day to everyone, as well as Eid Mubarak to those in the Philippines and the rest of Southeast Asia who are celebrating today. I'd like to start by providing just some elements of context related to the penetration of disinformation in the Philippines in general and Philippine elections in particular. The Philippines is one of the first countries where the potential for online disinformation to undermine democratic elections was noticed. 4 years ago now, the public policy director for global elections of Facebook explained, commenting on disinformation during the 2016 Philippine presidential elections, that, quote unquote, the Philippines was definitely patient zero for the war on disinformation. And the status of the Philippines as a test lab for disinformation operators seemed further confirmed in 2019 by the claim of Cambridge Analytica whistleblower that the Philippines was, for his company, Cambridge Analytica, an ideal petri dish situation to experiment on tactics and techniques. Many reasons have been cited to explain the vulnerability of the Philippines to online disinformation. The social media prevalence is certainly a major factor. Filipinos spend almost 11 hours using internet every day, the longest time worldwide, including 4 hours and 15 minutes using social media, here again a world record and approximately twice the global average. Ownership of a Facebook account is nearly universal among internet users in the Philippines, 99%. Another possible explanation is, of course, that the Philippine democratic model has some deep vulnerabilities, such as a weak political party system and personality-driven electoral campaigns. And then there is the geopolitical explanation, of course. The Philippines is also at the crossroads of various sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific and in a maritime strategic position, which makes it an attractive target for diverse foreign influence operators. One certainty is that the Philippines stand out in the global disinformation ecosystem in several ways. So are Filipinos concerned with the impact of disinformation on their elections? They are concerned. Last year, my organization, Internews, released the report, Information Dystopia and Philippine Democracy, based on a mass survey we conducted with over 19,000 Filipino respondents, probably the largest online survey conducted in the Philippines to date. And at the time of our survey, a vast majority of Filipinos, almost 80%, expressed being worried about the impact of disinformation on elections. So at less than 1 week of election day, shall we also be worried? On one hand, there is much more awareness in 2022 than in 2016, much more actions too by a vast array of Filipino stakeholders. This is a reason to be optimistic. It is much more difficult today to get away with a disinformation operation in the Philippines than it was in 2016. Social media companies are also stepping up. Some examples of action taken by the social media companies include, for example, Google Philippines and therefore YouTube announcing in December that they stopped accepting election advertisement for 2022 elections. As Marites reminded earlier, in January, Twitter took down over 300 accounts of supporters of candidate Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos for conducting coordinated campaign which violated Twitter policy on platform manipulation and spam. Social media platforms, pretty much all of them, have also been intensifying their partnership with news organizations and fact-checkers. Internews implements, for example, a program supported by Facebook, aiming to at least double the number of Philippine fact-checking organizations in 2022. On the other hand, there are undoubtedly reasons to be worried. Over the past 2 quarters, Internews has been collecting a large set of reports on cases of electoral disinformation through our social media monitoring mechanism, totoopa.info. These data confirm the evolution trends noticed since 2016. More granular, more deconcentrated disinformation operations, more videos, rise of micro-influencers and personal profiles, some of them masquerading as news pages. The disinformation phenomenon spreading horizontally between political groups and vertically between various levels of elections. So in brief, more numerous, more tailored, more widespread disinformation operations. The situation is not under control, and toxic digital operations, both by domestic actors and foreign actors, are becoming more complex, more present, more difficult to track in the Philippines. This is a reality that the Filipino electoral and legal framework and the electoral management body, the COMELEC, have not yet fully embraced. So to finish, I'd like to note that the issue of disinformation and the question of the safety of Filipino journalists are interrelated. In April 2019, 1 month only before the midterm elections, Malacanang, the Philippine presidential palace, released a conspiracy theory known as the Matrix, accusing several prominent independent media organizations to be conspiring to oust President Duterte. From May to June 2021, several human rights and media organizations were targeted by DDoS attacks, cyber attacks. The Sweden-based organization Curium, one of the best digital forensic group worldwide, investigated and traced these cyber attacks to networks of the Philippine Department of Science and Technology and the Philippine Army. So for this 2022 election cycle, cyber attacks on media websites have become almost routine, and a wave of cyber attacks has targeted numerous media organizations, most of which are partner of Internews in the past months. Rappler, Verifies, ABS-CBN, NUJP, Press One, Fistar, CNN Philippines, GMA News, Inquirer.net, even the Journalism Studies Association of the Philippines, a network of academics, were all targeted in the recent months, some of them several times, with little to no accountability for the perpetrators. And then, of course, there are the slandering campaign using red tagging, accusation to be connected to the communist insurgency, or accusation to be CIA operatives, or sometimes both, such as the recent campaign against the excellent fact-checking organization Verifies, illustrated on this slide. As we know too well, online vitriol against journalists sometimes turn indeed into offline threats and attacks in the Philippines and elsewhere. To just mention some recent cases, Baguio Correspondents and Broadcasters Club president Alwin Pitasol survived an attempt on his life in March. And just a few days ago, on April 13, Rappler journalist Lian Buan was blocked and shoved while attempting to interview presidential candidate Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Internews has been for 2.5 years implementing a large toolbox of measures to curb the spread of disinformation and improve journalist safety in the Philippines with our 13 partners from civil society, media, academia, and we are committed to continue doing so in the coming years. Our work on disinformation is based on the rationale that there is no silver bullet to address disinformation, and that tackling the pollution of the public discourse by online disinformation requires a multi-pronged, multi-stakeholder approach. It also requires to be unafraid to fail and to constantly test new methods, and as the disinformation operators and other online malign actors are themselves constantly testing the vulnerabilities of democratic systems. I do not have enough time to tell you now what we are doing in detail, but I will be glad to tell you more about our work during the Q&A. In the meantime, I'd like to conclude on the following point. The resilience and resistance of Filipinos in general and Philippine media in particular against attacks on their information ecosystem and democratic system deserve our solidarity and support and should inspire the democratic world. The Philippines is proving to be, once again, a front line of the great battle for democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, for your analysis. You built on what the two previous speakers said about disinformation, and you brought in some of the measures. You highlighted how Google and Twitter have taken down some posts. You introduced the idea of fact check, and one of the interesting things you mentioned was the role of the Election Commission. I think with the range of elections coming across the region, anticipated, in Thailand and in Malaysia and Cambodia, I think the role of the Election Commission to play a genuine role in countering disinformation during the campaign period is an important one to consider. So before I invite Eunice, who is in the studio with us here, I will want to go back to the poll result. We asked you this question at the start of the poll, which media has had more influence over voter sentiment so far on the presidential election campaign trail? Over 90% of you voted that it's social media. So it sits consistent with the analysis so far that the attention is really on social media and disinformation over the platform. I will now move to the next speaker, Eunice. Eunice, the floor is yours, and if I can ask the speaker, Eunice, to begin. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. If in the Philippines you encounter bots, here in Thailand we are encountering real people who acts like bots, like trolls. Okay, this election is largely influenced by the 2016 presidential election. So some of the topics that I will discuss is already discussed, so we will, please just click the next slide. Okay, the next slide. So I will focus on the OFWs in Thailand. So presently there are 17,921 Filipinos, registered Filipinos in Thailand. But the registered voters in Thailand are only 10,720 as of 2021. According to the Philippine Embassy, in 2016, when President Duterte won the election, not many Filipinos participated in the election. So I think the reason is during that time, social media was not that popular yet, especially among the OFWs. But right after the 2000, before the election, a few months before the election in 2016, the most popular social media site here in Thailand was Facebook. Okay, so we have here Duterte Eagles Thailand and DDS Thailand. So they were the most popular campaign pages for Duterte. No Facebook page for Marojas and other candidates. Okay, so Facebook has been the source of political views of the OFWs. That was starting 2016. And many are from Mindanao, solidly for Duterte, while the rest are mixed in their presidential bets. So although Lenny Robredo won the 2016 election, it's they still choose Duterte. And it also influenced the result of the 2019 midterm election. Okay, so no one from the LP or the minority political rivals won, but those who were endorsed by Duterte won during the 2019 midterm election. Okay, so the role of social media. This is among the OFW context. So they see it as a free and large platform. So they can post whatever is easy. And it is their alternative source of information that can translate into the physical world. Social media is real life for them. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so why do people call for trolls? Okay, again here I'm talking about my experiences here among the real people who are sharing disinformation and fake news. It's because of digital illiteracy. So for you in the Philippines or for many of us, you are engaging with trolls. But for me, I'm engaging with real people. I'm engaging with friends, okay, because they are digital illiterate. Okay, and then it gave them false empowerment and of course the engrossing storytelling. So they always tell that this is the truth. The social media is the truth and the mainstream media like me, they know me and I'm not telling the truth. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so it seems that like credible thing. Okay, so the social media reinforces their biases and everyone can be digitally illiterate, not only the boomers and the Gen Z. Okay, and some people get their information from what they see and hear, and without the immediate means to verify information, they passively accept it as a fact. They are very common among OFWs in Thailand because in 2016, the Cambridge Analytica really, I think they not only focused in the Philippines, but among the OFWs or the migrant Filipinos worldwide. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, false empowerment. Okay, people will flock to whatever platform is more intuitive for them to use. They feel empowered because they relate with the people on that platform. For example, on Facebook, on TikTok, not much on Twitter and what's that? Most of OFWs in Thailand use Facebook and later TikTok. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and engrossing stories. Social media capitalizes on stories and people can be misled by fake news and misinformation because peddlers of such narrative has mastered artful storytelling. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the roles of mainstream media. Okay, so during the election, so I start covering the election. I start writing about the election. Next slide, please. So that is to give information and to amplify the voice of migrant workers and inform us about the candidates' credentials and platforms. Okay, so source of information. So I started writing about how many Filipinos are registered voters in Thailand and what are their jobs here. So most Filipinos here are teachers and they work also in industries and as development workers. Okay, so amplifying the voice of the migrant workers. So I always interview reliable sources here. Okay, for example, Professor Amurao, she is always my reliable source here in Thailand. So most of the time, whenever I write about the election, whenever I write something about the migrant workers in Thailand, she is my information. Okay, next, informs the candidates' credential and platforms. Okay, in October, I wrote something about the fake degree of Marcos, and yet Filipinos in Thailand are still convinced that Marcos Jr. is the best bet, even though that particular article garnered more than 17,000 shares, and then I shared it to my Marcos friends and Marcos friends, supporters, and then still they don't believe me because they believe better on TikTok, on YouTube, and other Facebook posts. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so please go to the challenges. Okay, so the challenges among the mainstream media like us. Okay, so it is difficult for us to debunk lies. Or fact-checking remains a challenge to journalists, especially those of us who are based abroad. Okay, so we are competing with PRs or trolls, and the audiences are oftentimes left more confused than ever. So many would say that we are all liars. So mainstream media, even those other social media information, all of us become liars because we are not there, particularly the correspondents. So we are not there in the Philippines. How would I know? Have I talked to Marcos Jr.? No. Okay, and mainstream media are biased, always biased. For example, Inquirer.net, when we started criticizing the war on drugs, that was the start. We were trolled when we write about the corruption among the government officials like Duterte, that's biased. And the thing is, when they ask me, how would I know? I'm not in the Philippines. And I'm already biased because they said, I hate Duterte personally. Okay, so there is a question also of credibility amongst the mainstream media because many are really used. For example, the People's Tonight. Okay, even people whom you thought you knew or friends would not believe because their minds are already set to believe that everything on social media is spoken by ordinary people like them are gospel truth. Okay, those influencers are now the bearer of truths and news because they speak the same language, the Duterte gutter language. That's what they call totoong tao. They don't speak in rhetoric. They speak directly to them. They speak with them. Okay, so OFWs particularly see social media as a free platform where they learn about the things or events they did not know before. So the Taliano Gold, the Maharlika, everything, they keep telling that that's the truth. Okay, even though historically, they don't even believe in EDSA. So you see, they don't believe in EDSA. And those behind the memes, the videos, TikTok, etc., are telling the truth because they are not paid by media companies. We in the mainstream media, we are called bayarang media. We are paid because they think that every time we write a story, we are paid by our companies. Okay, so we are bayarang media, and they think that that those behind the memes, just like Sasot, just like Thinking Pinoy, that they are not paid. So they are not biased. So we are biased, and that's the challenge to us as mainstream media. And I think it will take another decade to erase that idea, to debunk that idea, especially now that social media is very, very popular even among the young people. So how can we combat that? So I think as journalists, we have to use both the mainstream media and the social media to counter misinformation. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, everyone, that was Eunice Novio, correspondent of Inquirer.net, and her perspective, she gave a great insight into the Filipino overseas voter conundrum and how social media is used to reach out to the overseas Filipino community as a case study from Thailand. Moving along, we now turn to the reactors. We have the first reactor. We have three of them in the house with us here. First is Joel Barredo. He's Executive Director of Shape C from Mahidol University. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really an...
There you are.
Fantastic. Technology, no? Yes. Thank you very much. I think I want to start with that. I mean, if not for technology, then we cannot have this very critical conversation. It's really my honor to be in the presence of the frontliners of knowledge and of the truth. Basically at this point, I think the battle is still very much long and winding. So we'll thank you so much for holding the line for everyone. I think I just want to remind everyone that misinformation, malinformation, disinformation is not unique to the Philippines. Historical revisionism either is not unique to the Philippines. I just came from Cambodia and I met with some young people there, and they don't believe that the Khmer Rouge genocide even happened, or they even doubt it at the very least. But what hurts the most when it comes to my country, the Philippines, is that we've been there, we've done that. We've toppled a dictator that built a government, a society around the myth that he is powerful, that he's king of the Philippines. We toppled a dictator that reigned with blood in his hands, with terror, with greed, and with a distorted legacy. And after toppling the government, we came up and we celebrated a constitution that has provisions of human rights and freedoms. Our civil society space, our media, our academia are generally free to be critical and to report and to disseminate information and knowledge. So, and that pains me the most. What happened to us Filipinas? Ano nangyari sa atin? I lived in an era of Friendster. I don't know if people can still remember Friendster. Friendster was the predecessor of Facebook, where people posted, still similar to Facebook, we posted our photos, we posted Facebook, and then remember the testimonial function where people actually said good things about you. But what happened to social media nowadays? Now it has become a sower of discord. Social media has been used to actually attack people, to destroy one's image, to destroy the ability to actually be free and to express oneself. And those are basic human rights. As a human rights defender and as a migrant person, I still see social media as a very important tool for someone with very little resources. Social media is a tool to mobilize, to build awareness, to actually be able to speak and tap different audiences. As a human rights defender, I don't believe in canceling people. I believe in the ability to reach out to people as much as possible, whether or not they have different political, social positions. But then again, social media has turned into a different creature, a monster at that, and it has attacked our democracy. We are living in a pandemic, not just a public health pandemic, but also a pandemic of the oppressed, where disinformation has strongly become an emerging culture and industry. Social media in this pandemic of the oppressed had become a tool of authoritarians to control our narratives, to tell us who we are and what we should be doing. It has also controlled the way that it tells us to curate a certain image of leadership, of actually who the Filipino really is and what the Filipino should actually be doing. It has actually turned our democracy into a kleptocracy. And now kleptocracy doesn't just mean about stealing one's wealth, but also stealing the ability to express, to speak our truths, to claim our rights, and the most important thing is to be free. But how do we move from this if disinformation becomes endemic? And I think it really is. I mean, again, misinformation is something that's happening all throughout the world. I think number one, we need to cut the demand stream. If misinformation or disinformation has become an industry for many people, then I think we need to find a way to cut that demand. And it very much will thrive in a global south, in a developing country, because people need to eat, people need to survive. We need to also mainstream accountability. Obviously, the government and also the different stakeholders. We need to bridge and address the information divide. Filipinos would understand this. There is a culture now of marites, or your friendly gossip monger. But why do we actually listen to gossip mongers? Because we are so busy at surviving. We are so busy at finding ways to actually go through the day. Again, I go down to deprivation, to poverty, inability to actually be decently human. And lastly, and I think this will be my end sentence, I think we need, and this is possible in the Philippines, we're known for that all throughout the world, to build and revive that critical consciousness. Filipinos are known to be very critical of different things. And I think in order to do that, and in order to, again, if we are pitted against a revival of a Marcos leadership, if we get to build that, if we start rebuilding that social critical consciousness, then I think we would be able to cut that line in the next 6 years or even much earlier. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel, for your remarks and your concern that how disinformation might actually overturn some of the democratic groundwork that has been put forward some years in the making in the Philippines. Next, I have Professor Annalisa Amurao, Chair Humanities and Language Division at Mahidol University. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much to our first set of speakers for sharing comprehensive information and analysis. I'd like first to pick portions from what they said and then combine them with my response by either expressing how I feel or what I think about each of them and or adding to what has already been said. Now, I see a pattern in what the four of you shared, underscoring what I see as 5 general issues that beset the country, namely, 1, the Philippines infodemic, 2, the reasons behind the infodemic, 3, the role of political elites and political operators resulting in said situation, 4, the different forms of threat that the Philippine media experience, and 5, the effects of said situation on the Philippine society. So let's start with the Philippines infodemic. So as we all know, the term infodemic was coined first in 2003 in relation to the flood of information accompanying the SARS outbreak back then. It is, of course, a flood of information epidemic. Now, in the context of our discussion, in as early as 2000, 2018, as shared with us by Greg, if I'm recalling the information correctly, the Philippines has been already referred to as patient zero, mainly because of the prevalence of fake news resulting in what is known as the infodemic across media. Of course, Krisha also pointed this out. This is not unique, as what Joel said. It's not unique to the Philippines, and this has been seen as well in a growing number of democracies. Having said that, it is safe to claim that the Philippines presents itself as a site to examine or scrutinize the mobilizing power of social media, especially during elections. Such an examination, I would say, should lead relevant organizations, think tanks, legitimate media outfits, educational institutions, and partner organizations to learn from whatever findings there are from said scrutiny and then use them to bring the country to move forward. Now, the second point I said is on identified reasons resulting in the said infodemic. Now, studies and reports that look into the prevalence of fake accounts, bots, and trolls attest to several Philippine societal issues, namely the opportunistic behavior of political elites and political operators, of course, with details shared with us by Marites, the lack of inquisitiveness of Filipino social media users. This means, this refers to their inability to recognize disinformation, the tendency to move further away from social cohesion and fair common purpose. And lastly, there's also the failure of the country's education system, formally and informally, to train people on how to deal with disinformation, so that eventually, if they're trained, then that they may become responsible digital citizens. Now, at the risk of sounding cliche-ish, I will stand by what I have always believed in as one of the best tools to enact change. I suppose this is, of course, primarily explained by where I'm coming from as an educator. Although these issues cannot be addressed overnight through education, they can nevertheless be tackled if the country's education system, both through the formal and informal infrastructures, is fixed. I think I'm going to go back to that one later. In the same manner that technology has been instrumental to how these issues came about, with the right planning, with the right people, with the right use of technology, these things can be employed to help turn things around. Okay, now third, on the role of political elites and operators. Again, reports and studies cite, as what already has been shared with us by our earlier speakers, that behind the handiwork of keyboard warriors, deployment of bots and trolls, and the like are actually unscrupulous political operators heavily financing political strategists. These operators are said to be enjoying a very strong level of protection from the country's political elites who have financed the use and spread of fake accounts, bots, and trolls, fueled by two motives: politics, perhaps on the side of the politicians behind it through their proxy political operators and strategies, and of course money also, both for the first group that I have already mentioned, and then for those who are benefiting from their work as trolls, as those who employ fake accounts and the like. Lastly, these so-called influence operating services. Okay, so this is how, in some other reports, this is how they are referred to as IOs. They are now, sad to say, of course, we all know that they're now a form of industry that is taken advantage of by those with political interests. Yeah. So having said this, again, I would say that this is not a unique experience. There's really a comprehensive coverage on how politicians and political elites, even abroad, have made use of this. So what's worth looking into now is how this practice has been allowed by social media giants such as Facebook, despite claims that community standards will be strictly enforced, and despite public calls of advocacy groups and other cause-oriented groups, including Nobel laureate Maria Ressa, who said, and I quote, What happens to us when the distribution of lies outpaces the distribution of these expensive evidence-based stories? Part of the reason why journalists are under attack has been that the same system first used for marketing is now being used for geopolitical power play. Now, fourthly, on the threat experienced by the media, we all know that journalists and journalism are constantly exposed to a hostile environment geared towards and calibrated in the form of online attacks. And this is largely due to the general public's perception of fake news as believable material, accepting them to be true, and unfortunately making them way too pervasive in Philippine society. All right, now I would move on to the last point that I said on the effects of said infodemic on the Philippine society. I would say that I would go back to my background as an educator. I would say that there are a number of possibilities that we can do. Again, from the education sector, there are things that we can do formally and informally. Let me just share with you a few things I have in mind. Revise the Philippine curriculum. Include media and digital literacy, digital citizenship, so as to make students more aware that the materials that they encounter now are not all trustworthy, brought about by free and easy access technology, a feature that wasn't there pre-internet, pre-social media. Bring back Philippine history in the Philippine curriculum. Update approaches to Philippine history in the Philippines, in the Philippine curriculum. But don't just bring it back for the sake of putting it back there, but examine it, reevaluate it, update it, make the approach to Philippine education interdisciplinary so that the students see the benefit of doing so from a more holistic approach. Yeah, in the informal setting, this can be done by partnering with different institutions that have the same thrust, offer courses to different groups, create materials that have wider reach, especially for groups or grassroots, and both those that are based in the country and those that are residing outside of the Philippines. And I'd like to end by saying that as much as I want to offer straightforward answers that the current situation begs for, I offer instead questions. May they nudge each of us to think of how we all can be part of the solution to the problems that the 21st century setting poses upon us. First question, other than fact-checking online and social media posts, how can use of these fact-check materials be maximized so that their purpose goes beyond proving that they are one form of disinformation? Another question, despite the known benefits that IOs generate for social media platforms and the current practice of companies such as Facebook, with deleting fake accounts, freezing accounts that violate community standards, how else can social media platforms be asked to help address disinformation issues without having to curtail users' freedom of expression, among other rights? And when disinformation campaigns succeed at making fake news believable and pervasive in Philippine society, the job of making people unlearn and correct what they have read about proves to be a very difficult task. So who else can individuals and organizations turn to so that facing this gigantic problem eventually becomes much easier to do? Thank you. Magandang hapon po.
Thanks, Professor Annalisa. From the suite of commentary, maybe I just pick up a couple of things. You spoke about how disinformation actually receives protection, especially those in power. You also mentioned the non-action towards disinformation by tech companies. So just some food for thought. So over to add, I guess be independent, but also formerly Executive Director of the Southeast Asian Press Alliance. Over to you, Ed.
Okay, thank you, James. I'll speak as a press freedom and a digital rights advocate. Since a lot of you have already discussed the contours and the analysis of how the disinformation operates in the Philippines, I would like to focus on what are the rules governing election election propaganda in the Philippines and speech. I think James mentioned this earlier, that is important to look at the rules. So the COMELEC issues like a new set of rules each time there's an election. And I would like to describe the COMELEC's current rules in governing election propaganda and advertisement as horribly late, inadequate, and out of touch. Just to give a background, in 2016, when Duterte successfully succeeded in winning the elections mainly through Facebook, through social media, COMELEC's rules at that time still hasn't considered the use of social media in election campaigns. So in fact, the rules describe limitations in terms of size of advertisements in websites, when Facebook has already been existing 8 years. The Philippines is already a leading consumer of information through social media. In 2019, the rules have incorporated social media, but what it only did was to self-report. So I'm a candidate, this is my website, COMELEC, please be informed. And then there's also a phrase there describing that pages and websites that even if they're not owned and controlled by the candidates can be considered campaign websites of social media pages if the main content is about the candidate. So now in 2022, those rules about self-registration in COMELEC of social media pages has persisted. The additional rules that they added was that they require verification of the candidates' pages before they're allowed to post advertisements. And then they have disallowed micro-targeting except by location, by age, and by gender. So it really doesn't match the importance of the role of social media, the social media plays in our election and election communications. It seems to be stuck in advertisement, looking at political advertising and political expenses, which is not wrong, but it's not inadequate. Now, for example, in January, a news report came out that among the presidential candidates, Leni Robredo was a top spender on Facebook. And Ferdinand Marcos, interestingly, did not spend a single centavo on Facebook advertising. Despite his presence in that social media platform, he did not spend money on Facebook. I think we all know where Bongbong Marcos spends his money for Facebook. It's through, as mentioned earlier, it's through influencers, through pages, through. So a lot of machinery that Bongbong Marcos uses for Facebook, for propaganda on Facebook, is not going to Facebook advertising stream. And that's really interesting. And I wonder if this is pre-elections, and I wonder if what the update is. So that's something that we should look at. So it doesn't even cover influencers. It's like a feature of social media. And then you have to add those inadequate rules to COMELEC's non-proactive approach in terms of enforcing its own rules. Like famously, several presidential candidates have been giving out money to prospective voters. But COMELEC does not do anything because it's still not election season. What kind of incredulous to look at that? Well, the vote buying is so blatant. It's even televised, reported by all sorts of media. But then COMELEC doesn't do anything because election season hasn't started yet. No? So you add this kind of attitude and capacity to inadequate rules, and we see the situation we're in now, no? Which is like if you're updating what happened to patient zero since 2016, we're in worse shape. Yeah. Okay. Facebook also recently said they will have action on fake news, no, but they only concern themselves with fake news related to the conduct of the elections and against COMELEC, the conduct of the COMELEC, which is like I don't think if it's a percentage of the amount of fake news, in social media, the amount that is related to the conduct of the election is quite small. No? So it's like they're not even looking at what is happening in the area they're supposed to control. Yeah. So there. No? So I think there should be a lot of reflection and studying for government, for the incoming Congress to look at how social media is regulated in relation to elections, no? Because the rules are really inadequate and out of date. Secondly, if you look at the larger policy direction of the Philippines in relation to social media, and we had this SIM card registration act that was enacted by Congress in January, late January, and then it was revoked by Duterte. So that law follows what many other Southeast Asian countries, among others, have already been doing in terms of requiring people to present official identification before they buy SIM cards. Now, in that bill, there was an inserted provision about using real identity for registering social media. And that's the reason why Duterte vetoed it, because it wasn't in the original intent of the law. As digital rights advocate, it's like very concerning that the government will resort to like blunt and ineffective measures to control this thing that we are looking now. Like for example, in Thailand, we have a social media registration since 2015, but that hasn't stopped disinformation operations from happening. That hasn't stopped financial scams in cell phones. So despite the law and the enforcement of that similar framework, it hasn't stopped what they were trying to present. In fact, you can say that these sorts of measures only empower the state to centralize this information operations to disadvantaging the civil society and the opposition. So it's not looking good for the Philippines policy-wise, but I think there should be some serious reflection and debate on how do you even start unpacking and fixing this problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed, for unpacking the role of the commission, especially in the context of the Philippines, that more could be done. But I think there's a lesson here for the wider region and the role of, election commissions and how they oversight quality of, election advertising. There are a few questions that have come in. I'm going to just throw out a question. This is to address to the three speakers on screen, Maritas, Krisha, and also Eunice, who is in the house. The question is, if the Marcos Duterte tandem will win, bracket, God forbidden, in the upcoming elections, what will be the foreseen situation and setup for the free press, mainstream journalists, campus, future journalists, and the alternative media journalists? If I can invite the three journalists on screen to think about it for a minute. And before that, may I just take the opportunity to plug a report jointly, a very timely report to commemorate World Press Freedom Day, which is Media Freedoms in Southeast Asia, co-published by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and Asia Center. We will be sending you links and QR codes for you to access this report online. But since I have Vanessa here with me, who's also a former journalist and covering the media program in the region for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and just recently returned from the Philippines, Vanessa, your thoughts, you've heard the conversation both from the speakers and our reactors. What's your feeling? I mean, what's the analysis from where you are sitting in terms of what's the conversation we are having today?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Also, for giving me the opportunity to react on this very interesting discussion. For someone who comes or sees everything a little bit from the outside, you all gave a lot of background about, and also the details about what is going on in the Philippines. Why is it special, this petri dish that you are working in, and what really is happening also? Because of course, as someone from Germany, our past has been difficult, and we have a culture of really going through it, having a lot of education about what happened in the right in Germany at the Nazi time, and we really try to work it out. Sometimes it is not fruitful. We also still have problems, of course, but we really try to work it out. And from this perspective, it's hard to imagine that someone coming from the family of a dictator is able to convince so many people that it is a good choice to vote for that family and for that heritage again. But thank you, Maritas, and also the other speaker, to shine a little light on how that is even possible. And also thank you all very much for also painting not only the details, but also painting the bigger picture, that disinformation is not only a problem in the Philippines. Of course, it's a little bit stating the obvious, but it's also important to always see the bigger picture, to remind ourselves that we are aware of the problem, but we yet have not a definite solution for it. As we heard, I think also in this conversation or in this discussion, we got a lot of hintings, a lot of points, what can be done. But I think it's also very important to keep this discussion going about this topic.
Thanks, Vanessa, for your perspective. So back to our three journalists, there's a few questions, so we'll go on for another 15 minutes. I'm going to draw all speakers and reactors into these questions. But to kick off, Maritas, and I'll read the question again for the journalists on screen. If the Marcos Duterte tandem will win in the upcoming elections, what will be the foreseen situation and setup for free press in the Philippines? Maritas, can you please begin? Thank you.
Yes, I've been thinking about that because just observing Marcos Jr. on the campaign trail, he's the least open. He doesn't grant interviews to all. He's very selective. In a rare press conference, they did not invite everyone. I mean, not everyone in the media, and they screened questions. It is such a rare press conference, yet he screened questions. So anyway, and if he wins, I think this information will continue. He will rely on it. Maybe now, if he wins as president, then it will be state-sponsored disinformation. Number two, he will really undermine independent media. He wants to cast doubt on independent media. And number three, we will continue to have a secretive office of the president, Malacanang Palace, similar to Duterte, who has not really been transparent. So that's my fear. And it will be a tough time. I'm sorry to this campus journalists who asked the question. We have tough times ahead, but we have to continue doing our work. And the fact checkers are also under attack. They will continue to be attacked. I think we have to be all on steroids to do what we have to do. So I'm not really painting a worst case scenario, but I think this will be some of the realities.
Thank you, Marites. Over to you, Krisha, for your quick thoughts on this.
I pretty much share what Ms. Vitug has said, pretty much all of it. In terms of what I think will happen under his presidency, I think we can already take cues from how his campaign is currently treating members of the press that are covering his campaign trail right now. I don't claim to be an expert or am I privy to their experiences, because my experience covering Vice President Leni Robredo has been the complete opposite. She and her media team has been open, they're very transparent and accommodating to the press. But some of my friends who do cover the Marcos campaign trail, they report being boxed out of coverage, itineraries being deliberately withheld from them. He repeatedly refuses to grant ambush interviews. And I'm sure you've seen the videos where one colleague of mine, I don't know if I can name her here. Well, it's already public anyway. Lian Buan was being shoved by his staff while she was trying to get an ambush interview during coverage. And then in separate interviews where he was asked questions about how he will treat the press, he said that he will be open to the media, but the evidence has suggested otherwise. And he has mentioned that he distrusts fake fact checkers because he thinks that they're biased against him. And if you can remember, the reason why he dodged the Jessica Soho interview was because he said that Jessica Soho was biased against him and his family. So in a nutshell, not to be apocalyptic or anything, but the picture really seems bleak under a Marcos presidency. It will really be a tough time in terms of transparency, in terms of access to Malacanang. But earlier in the day, the National Union of Journalists in the Philippines released a statement saying something along the lines of, the work of journalists will not rise or fall on the outcome of the May elections. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Our work will not depend on who is in Malacanang. I think we should just continue doing the work that we do. It's going to be tougher under Marcos presidency, but I think the mandate of our job will not change in any way.
Thank you, Krisha. Then maybe quickly to Eunice, your thoughts on the same question, please.
Okay, I think that would be the darkest age in press freedom. And I think we would go underground. I'm quite lucky because I'm not in the Philippines. So I can still work other job. Anyway, I'm also teaching here. But of course, I have to be with my fellow journalists in the Philippines also. That forbids. Wag naman.
Thank you, Eunice. Greg, you work for Internews. Internews is concerned about, ensuring, free press. From where you are sitting, working with colleagues in the Philippines, you've heard so much today about disinformation, the role of social media. Here's a question that asks, what remedies can one advocate for to deal with these social media abuses, as has been outlined by many of the speakers and yourself included. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much. That's a difficult question. But I will start where I almost ended my presentation. There is no silver bullet against disinformation. As reminded by several speakers today, this is not a phenomenon which is specific to the Philippines. The Philippines is a particularly relevant and interesting case because of the prevalence, the penetration of social media, the prevalence of disinformation in the political landscape. But many of the tactics we have seen experimented, tested in the Philippines in 2016 were used in following elections across the globe, including the US elections. It impacts old and newer democracies as much. It is truly the new great threat against democratic models. As I mentioned, no silver bullet in the assessment of Internews. So there are a few programmatic principles we apply when we work on this information. One is the importance to work on both the supply and the demand sides of disinformation. The supply side, essentially, the toxic actors themselves, the social media companies when it comes to online disinformation, but we should never forget that there is also offline disinformation, and that it's really important to work at community level, offline, on non-online sources of disinformation, and then of course the demand side, the citizenry itself. As I mentioned to you in our preparatory conversations ahead of this event, we essentially work along 6 tracks on disinformation, and we believe any impactful program on disinformation should really try to cover those 6 tracks. The first one is the first line of defense, fact-checking and myth-busting. We have heard a lot that fact-checking is not enough. That's absolutely true, but it's an extremely important first line of defense, and fact-checkers need to be supported. The second aspect, which was mentioned by several speakers too, is media literacy, information and media literacy, to make the communities more resilient to disinformation. And that some work can be done on short terms through information campaign, awareness rising, but there is definitely a long-term perspective there, and something which directly involve educational question, and therefore possibly partnership with Department of Education in various countries impacted by this phenomenon. The third and fourth aspect, I always mention those two together because they are related, what we call investigating disinformation and algorithm accountability. We cannot continue treating only the symptoms of disinformation. We need to understand who are behind disinformation operations, be they domestic actors or foreign actors. We have both in the Philippine context, and it's important to understand the operators, the dynamics, their drive. Some are driven by ideological purposes, some others by greed, by money. It's really important to understand the disinformation ecosystem to be able to tackle the phenomenon. A fifth aspect, which surprisingly is forgotten too often, is the importance to invest in trustworthy, fact-based media. And that can be done in many ways. It can be by supporting data journalism, but it can also be, for example, one work we do in the Philippines currently, through partnering with the private sector to make sure that the advertising is not going to fuel with money disinformation operators and clickbait pages. And that's one of the things we are piloting in the Philippines in the context of this pre-election period, working with the big group, the big business companies of the Philippines, to encourage them to place their ads on trustworthy media sources away from disinformation operators. And then the last of the 6 tracks I mentioned, in our view, is policy advocacy. And that's a very, very tricky aspect, because we need to be sure that any steps, and notably any legal steps taken to prevent disinformation, will not limit freedom of information and freedom of expression. And when we think about regulating the issue of disinformation, we always need to do that from the angle of protecting internet freedom. And there are other policy angles which we are exploring, for example, self-regulation of the media sector. National Union of Journalists of the Philippines was mentioned a bit earlier. We are notably working with them on ethical guidance for Filipino journalists. So that's another aspect of policy which is interesting to to investigate. So yeah, in brief, we do not believe that any of these 6 tracks is sufficient. But we do believe that those 6 tracks combined in one project can start making a difference, can start having an impact in curbing the impact of disinformation on a political process, on society in general.
Thank you, Greg. As a final question, I'm just going to lump a couple of questions together to come to the essence of what was being asked. And I'm going to turn to the 3 reactors here at Asia Center here in Bangkok. Starting first with Joel. What is the key difference between the last elections in terms of the role of social media and now in this current, between 2016 and 22, what is the difference between these 2 campaign trails? If there's something that strikes you at all.
Okay. 2 things, no? We're still having this election in a pandemic. So that means that reliance on technology, on social media has become much greater. I mean, there is a lot of, I believe, well, social media played a very huge role in 2016, but I think right now, social media has become the dominant source of information. It's not also deny the fact that not just social media, but even like Viber, WhatsApp, have also become sources of disinformation. Your friends or your uncle can actually provide you with information. I actually personally got one myself. But I think the other thing is the difference between 2016 and 2022 is that we should know better right now. That there are reports, there are verified reports of how social media has been used to disseminate this information. But now, while there is much greater awareness of it, we still tolerate such malinformation to spread around. So that's a difference. I mean, we should be 6 years smarter, wiser than 2016.
Fortunately.
Melissa, over to you. Your quick thoughts
Okay.
between the 2 campaign years.
I would say that particularly the front runner now has learned further how to use social media, influencers, and the like from the Duterte experience. And I think he has anchored his strategies on that. And we also see other power players in the May 2022 elections that were not there in the 2016 elections. And I think all these, conflate together to make it very different from how it was several years ago.
Okay, great. And Ed, the last one.
I think right now we're seeing the bigger impact of social media in terms of how the election, how do you say that? The surveys, no? Because in 2016, Duterte did not really figure in the surveys. But now we have seen the success of the disinformation machinery of Bongbong Marcos. He has been leading since forever, right? Despite the best efforts of the Leni Robredo camp, no, but the only I think the only disconnect that we are seeing is that Leni Robredo is able to mobilize more people physically than Bongbong Marcos, and the crowds are livelier. So I think there's some hope there in terms of she performs better on Google Trends over Ferdinand Marcos. So, but the problem, I think I go back to the point I raised earlier that our rules are they really bear review and checking and I think we will be having a better chance of improving the situation if Leni Robredo wins because she's a victim of disinformation. But the only problem, the only caution I would put there is that there's a tendency for using blunt force and shotgun approach to like the SIM registration law. And in fact, the social media registration provision of that law, which was vetoed was introduced by a member of Lenny Robredo's party. So I don't think politicians still understand how to address this, and they would resort to curtailing human rights rather than fixing this problem of disinformation as it should be.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Pointing to the importance of rulemaking, but yet, cautioning that it's better to take a rights-based approach when it comes to rulemaking. We are now coming to the end of our event. Before to let you go, just to immerse you on another poll. Of course, like in all elections, we have to make a prediction. So,
Are you doing that?
so we predict is the winner of this election is mainstream media or the social media. So the votes is there. I think this is fairly appropriate given the discussion we have had today. While you are casting your vote, I would also seek your support to give us some feedback on the event. We have our survey. We just want to know how you found the event, what was your takeaway, and also any feedback you have for us to strengthen the event the next time around. Without further ado, I will now pass the time back to Nalindra, who will guide us through the closing process. Over to you, Nalindra.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. James. So once again, I would like to remind you that our report in partnership with Trading Finance Foundations on the referendum in Southeast Asia is available for free downloads on Asia Central websites and for Freedom website. So please feel free to check that out. And I also want to quickly highlight a few upcoming events in partnership with Trading Foundations. So we going to have EU Southeast Asia Regional Conference in June, and also the International Conference on Freedom of Expression in Asia, and the Business and Human Rights trainings, as well as the International Days to End Impunity for Press and Journalists. And yeah, also please feel free to follow us on our social media. We have Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikToks, Twitters, and YouTube channels. And yeah, I think, ladies and gentlemen, I think it comes to the end of the events. I would like to take this opportunity to express my special thanks to all the reactor and speakers and all the participants here in our studios and all Zooms. It's wonderful to have all of you here, and we really look forward to see you in the future events. So thank you very much.